Lingqi. For centuries in imperial China, there was a punishment reserved for the worst crimes imaginable: treason, mass murder, crimes against the emperor. It was called Lingqi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts. The name sounds almost poetic, but the reality wasn't. The victim would be tied to a wooden frame, completely immobilized, and then the executioner would begin. Small cuts, carefully placed, not random. Each slice was deliberate, designed to prolong suffering as much as possible. Pieces of flesh would be removed slowly from the chest, the arms, the legs, and this didn't happen in isolation. It was public. Crowds would gather, not just to watch, but to remember. Because the goal wasn't just punishment, it was a message. This is what happens when you defy the state. Sometimes, the execution could last hours. In rare cases, longer. And when it finally ended, what remained barely resembled a human body. Lingqi wasn't just execution, it was psychological warfare. Brazen bull. If Lingqi was about slow suffering, ancient Greece had something even more theatrical. It was called the brazen bull, invented supposedly by a man named Perilos, who thought he had created something brilliant. The concept was simple: a hollow bull made entirely of bronze. The victim would be placed inside, and then a fire would be lit beneath it. As the metal heated up, the person inside would slowly cook alive. But that's not the worst part. The bull was designed with a system of tubes and pipes that transformed the victim's screams into something else. As the person burned, their cries would echo through the bull's mouth, sounding like a bull roaring. So to anyone outside, it didn't sound like a human being dying. It sounded like an animal, a performance, a spectacle. And here's the twist. According to legend, the inventor himself was the first person to be executed in it, because the ruler he presented it to decided to test it on him. Drawn and quartered. Medieval Europe didn't hold back either, especially when it came to treason. If you betrayed the king, your punishment wasn't just death, it was destruction. This was called hanged, drawn, and quartered, and it happened in stages. First, you were dragged through the streets, publicly humiliated. Then, you were hanged, but not until death, just enough to bring you close. Then came the real horror. You were cut down, still alive, and disemboweled, organs removed, sometimes burned in front of you. And finally, your body was divided into 4 parts, each piece sent to different locations, displayed as a warning. This wasn't justice, this was power. A way for rulers to say, you don't just die for betraying me, you disappear. Rat torture. Now this one is different because it doesn't rely on blades or fire. It relies on something far more unpredictable: fear. This method was reportedly used in various parts of history, including Europe. Here's how it worked. A cage filled with rats was placed on a person's body, usually the stomach. Then, heat was applied to the cage. The rats, desperate to escape the rising temperature, had only one direction to go: down. Through the victim. They would claw, bite, and burrow, trying to escape the heat, and the human body became their path. It wasn't instant, it wasn't clean, it was chaotic, and that's what made it so terrifying, because once it started, there was no controlling it. Scaphism. If you thought things couldn't get worse, ancient Persia has something to say. This method is known as scaphism, or more disturbingly, the boats. The victim would be placed between 2 hollowed-out boats, trapped, unable to move. Then, they would be force-fed milk and honey, not to nourish them, but to keep them alive and attract insects. Their body would be covered in the same mixture, left exposed, floating in stagnant water. Over time, insects would begin to gather, flies, maggots. They would breed, feed, and multiply on the victim, inside the victim. Days would pass, sometimes weeks. The person wouldn't just die, they would decompose while still alive. Impalement. If there's one punishment that became synonymous with pure terror, it's this one: impalement. Used in various parts of the world, but most famously associated with Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler. The method was exactly what it sounds like. A long, sharpened stake would be forced through the body, usually from below, and then the victim would be raised upright. Now here's where it becomes horrifyingly precise, because a skilled executioner wouldn't aim to kill immediately. They would position the stake in a way that avoided vital organs. So instead of dying quickly, the victim would remain alive, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, slowly sliding down the stake under their own weight, every movement causing more internal damage, more pain, more suffering. And like many punishments on this list, it wasn't hidden. Fields of impaled bodies were often displayed outside cities, hundreds, sometimes thousands, lining the landscape, a forest of death, designed to send a message that didn't need words. Breaking wheel. Now this one is controversial. because historians still debate whether it was actually used or mostly a later invention. But the idea itself is disturbing enough to earn a place here. The Iron Maiden, a human-sized metal coffin, lined on the inside with spikes. The victim would be placed inside, and then the door would slowly close. The spikes weren't always designed to kill instantly. Instead, they were positioned to pierce the body without hitting vital organs. So when the door shut, you didn't die immediately, you just couldn't move. Every breath, every slight shift pushed the spikes deeper. It was a punishment built not just for pain, but for psychological torture, because you knew exactly what was happening to you every second. Keel hauling. Punishments weren't limited to land. At sea, things were just as brutal. This one was used by navies, especially during the age of sail. It's called keel hauling. The victim, usually a sailor accused of a serious offense, would be tied with a rope, thrown overboard, and then dragged under the ship, from one side to the other. Now imagine the underside of a wooden ship, covered in barnacles, sharp, jagged, unforgiving. As the person was pulled across, their body would be torn apart, skin shredded, muscle ripped open, and if they didn't drown first, the injuries alone would be enough. But sometimes that wasn't the end, because in certain cases they were pulled back up and forced to endure it again. The wheel. In medieval Europe, there was another method designed not just to kill, but to destroy the body completely. It was called breaking on the wheel. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, spread out, limbs extended, and then the executioner would begin. Using a heavy hammer or iron bar, they would strike the bones, one by one, arms, legs, each blow shattering bone, but not enough to kill. The goal was to break the body, systematically, until it was no longer recognizable. Once the bones were crushed, the body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel, and then raised on a pole, displayed, still alive in some cases, left there for hours, sometimes days, until death finally came. Flaying. Some punishments weren't about breaking the body, they were about removing it, layer by layer. Flaying. The act of removing a person's skin while they were still alive. This method has been recorded in multiple civilizations, from ancient Assyria to parts of medieval Europe. The process required precision. The executioner would begin with small incisions and then slowly peel the skin away, not all at once, but gradually, to prolong the suffering. And in some cases, the skin of the victim would be displayed publicly, hung on walls, or preserved as a warning. A message not just to the individual, but to everyone who saw it, because nothing communicates fear quite like seeing what's left of someone who crossed the line. The bamboo torture. Now this one feels almost unreal, but it's often cited in discussions of historical torture. Bamboo torture. Bamboo is one of the fastest growing plants in the world. Some species can grow several inches in a single day, and that's exactly what made this method possible. The victim would be tied down, directly above young bamboo shoots, and then left there. As the bamboo grew, it wouldn't stop. It would push upward, slowly, relentlessly, piercing through the body. Over time, the shoots would emerge on the other side. It wasn't fast, it wasn't dramatic, it was slow, quiet, and completely unstoppable. The blood eagle. Some punishments weren't just executions, they were rituals, or at least they were meant to look like one. The blood eagle is often associated with Viking lore, and while historians debate how often it actually happened, the description alone is enough. The victim would be restrained, and then their back would be cut open, ribs severed from the spine, one by one, and then pulled outward to resemble wings, hence the name. The lungs would be exposed, sometimes even pulled out, placed over the wings. If the victim was still alive at this point, which is unlikely, every breath would be agony. But the purpose wasn't efficiency, it was symbolism, a display of dominance, a message to enemies. This is what awaits you. Being boiled alive. Execution by boiling might sound simple, but in reality, it was anything but. Used in medieval Europe and parts of Asia, this punishment involved exactly what you think. The victim would be placed into a large container filled with water, or oil, or even tar, and then slowly heated. That part matters, because it wasn't always dropped into boiling liquid. Sometimes the liquid started cold, and the temperature would rise gradually, which meant the victim experienced every stage, from warmth to discomfort to unbearable heat, until the skin began to blister and then break. It was a punishment that turned the human body into something fragile, something temporary. Saw. This one is brutally simple, and that's what makes it worse. Execution by sawing. The victim would be suspended, usually upside down. Why upside down? Because it kept blood flowing to the brain, keeping them conscious longer. Then a saw, starting at the groin and slowly cutting downward or upward, depending on the method. There was no skill required, no precision needed, just time and endurance. And the horrifying part is, this method has appeared in multiple cultures across different time periods, which means different societies came up with the same idea, independently. Burial alive. Sometimes, punishment didn't involve tools at all, just isolation. Burial alive, used in various forms throughout history, often as a punishment for betrayal or breaking strict societal rules. The victim would be placed in a confined space, a pit, a coffin, a sealed chamber, and then covered, left alone, in complete darkness. At first, there's panic. Breathing becomes faster. The air feels thinner. Time becomes unclear. Minutes feel like hours. And then, slowly, oxygen runs out. This wasn't just physical punishment. It was psychological, because the victim knew exactly what was happening, and there was nothing they could do about it. Crucifixion. One of the most infamous execution methods in history. Crucifixion. Used extensively by the Romans, it wasn't just about death, it was about humiliation. The victim would be nailed or tied to a wooden cross, left exposed, often in public places, and then they would wait. Death didn't come quickly. It came slowly, through exhaustion, through dehydration, through suffocation, because hanging in that position made it harder to breathe. Each breath required effort, pushing up against the nails, against the wood, against the pain, until eventually the body simply couldn't continue, and it stopped. But the real purpose was visibility, a warning to anyone who thought about resisting.